The small diner on the outskirts of town had been a community cornerstone for over 4 decades. Its faded blue awning and neon sign had witnessed countless stories unfold within its warm, welcoming walls. On this particular summer evening, the gentle hum of ceiling fans mixed with the clinking of cutlery as the dinner rush began to wind down. Behind the counter, a young waitress wiped down the coffee-stained surface, her honey-blonde hair tied back in a messy bun. She'd been working double shifts all week to help pay for her nursing school textbooks. The regulars knew her as Sunshine for her ability to maintain a bright smile even during the longest, most exhausting days. The bell above the door chimed as a group of 5 bikers strutted in, their heavy boots echoing against the checkered floor. Their leather vests were adorned with patches and pins, marking them as members of a local motorcycle club that had recently started causing trouble in neighboring towns. The atmosphere in the diner immediately shifted, like storm clouds gathering before rain. The waitress straightened her apron and grabbed her notepad, approaching their table with professional courtesy despite the uncomfortable glances from other customers. "Welcome to Betty's Diner. What can I get for you all today?" she asked, maintaining her composure as the bikers exchanged knowing smirks. The largest of the group, his beard streaked with gray, leaned back in the booth. "Well, sweetheart, why don't you start by giving us your number?" His companions snickered, and one wolf whistled. The waitress felt her cheeks flush but kept her voice steady. "I'm here to take your food order, sir. Nothing else." As she turned to leave, one of the bikers grabbed her wrist. "Come on, don't be like that. We're just trying to be friendly." The grip wasn't painful, but the message was clear: they weren't used to taking no for an answer. The other diners watched in tense silence, a few elderly couples quietly asking for their checks. What the bikers didn't know was that the quiet old man sitting at the counter, seemingly absorbed in his newspaper and coffee, was the waitress's grandfather. He'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, earning multiple medals for valor that now sat in a dusty display case at home. More importantly, he'd spent the last 40 years teaching self-defense classes to local law enforcement. The grandfather slowly folded his newspaper, his weathered hands steady as he placed it beside his half-empty coffee cup. His eyes, sharp despite his age, had been tracking the bikers' every move since they entered. He'd seen bullies like this before, men who mistook kindness for weakness and used their size to intimidate others. The tension in the diner continued to build as the bikers became more aggressive in their comments and gestures. The waitress maintained her professional demeanor, but her hands trembled slightly as she wrote down their orders. Her grandfather noticed this subtle sign of distress. It reminded him of the fear he'd seen in civilians' eyes decades ago, in villages halfway around the world. Other customers began quietly leaving the diner, dropping cash on their tables and hurrying out. The cook in the kitchen, a longtime friend of the family, reached for the phone, ready to call the police. But the grandfather raised his hand slightly, signaling him to wait. He'd handled situations like this before, and he knew that sometimes the threat of force was more effective than force itself. The evening sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows as the situation approached its breaking point. The bikers' laughter grew louder, their comments more crude, and their behavior more threatening. They seemed to feed off each other's bravado, each one trying to outdo the others in their harassment of the young waitress. To the casual observer, the grandfather appeared to be just another elderly customer, his plaid shirt and worn jeans blending into the background of the small-town diner. But those who knew him could see the subtle changes in his posture, the way his eyes narrowed slightly, and the careful way he pushed his coffee cup aside. He was preparing himself, not for a fight, but for something the bikers wouldn't expect. The other customers who remained watched with a mixture of concern and curiosity. They'd known the grandfather for years, seen him at church potlucks and town meetings, but few knew about his military background or the skills he'd honed over decades of training others. They were about to witness a side of him that rarely emerged in their peaceful community. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting an orange glow through the diner's windows, the situation was about to take an unexpected turn. The grandfather's patience had limits, and these men were about to discover exactly where those limits lay. His granddaughter's safety and dignity were lines they'd crossed without realizing the consequences that awaited them. The grandfather's movement from his counter seat was so subtle that at first, no one noticed. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and straightened his back, years of military bearing emerging through his elderly frame. The floorboards creaked softly under his measured steps as he approached the biker's table, each stride purposeful and unhurried. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority that had commanded troops in combat. "I couldn't help but notice you're making my granddaughter uncomfortable." The diner fell silent, save for the gentle hum of the ceiling fans and the distant sizzle of the grill. The lead biker turned, amusement playing across his face as he sized up the elderly man. "This is none of your business, old-timer. Why don't you go back to your coffee before you hurt yourself?" His companions chuckled, but there was a note of uncertainty in their laughter. Something in the grandfather's steady gaze made them shift in their seats. "You know," the grandfather continued, as if sharing a casual observation, "in my experience, true strength isn't about intimidation. I learned that lesson the hard way, in places where the sound of motorcycles was replaced by helicopter rotors, and the choices we made meant the difference between life and death." He pulled up a chair from a nearby table, sitting down with the ease of someone who had all the time in the world. The lead biker's face darkened, but before he could speak, the grandfather reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself, standing alongside his fellow soldiers in a distant jungle. "This was taken after we rescued a village from people who thought strength meant terrorizing the innocent. My team and I spent 3 days tracking them through the jungle. Not because we were the strongest or the toughest, but because we understood that real power lies in protecting others." The waitress watched from behind the counter, her hands clasped together, as her grandfather continued speaking in that same calm, measured tone. The other customers in the diner had stopped pretending to eat, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. "Now, I could tell you about the medals they gave me, or the hand-to-hand combat techniques I've been teaching to law enforcement for 40 years. But that's not what's important here." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "What's important is that you gentlemen have a choice to make. The same choice those troublemakers in that village had to make." One of the younger bikers, who had been silent until now, pushed his plate away. "Look, we didn't mean any harm. We were just having some fun." The grandfather nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this perspective. "Fun is a wonderful thing," he agreed. "I remember the fun I had teaching my granddaughter to ride a bike, to stand up for herself, to be proud of who she is. But what you're doing isn't fun. It's the kind of behavior that makes good men into cowards and cowards into bullies." The lead biker's face had transformed during this conversation, the cocky smirk replaced by something more contemplative. He looked at his reflection in the window, then at his companions, seeing them perhaps for the first time through different eyes. The grandfather stood up slowly, placing the photograph back in his wallet. "The coffee here is excellent, and my granddaughter makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. I'd be happy to order some for all of you, and we can continue this conversation like civilized men. Or you can leave now, with the understanding that this type of behavior won't be tolerated in our town." A long moment passed as the bikers exchanged glances. The diner held its collective breath, the evening sun casting long shadows across the checkered floor. The decision hanging in the air would determine more than just the outcome of this evening, it would reveal the true character of these men who had swaggered in thinking they owned the place. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the grandfather remained perfectly calm, his presence a reminder of a different kind of strength, one built not on intimidation, but on wisdom, experience, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. The lead biker drummed his fingers on the table, his weathered knuckles telling stories of past fights and hard roads. His eyes moved from the grandfather to the waitress, then to his own reflection in the window. In that moment, he saw something that made him pause, perhaps a glimpse of the man he used to be, or the man he could become. "You know what, old-timer," he said finally, his voice softer than before. "Nobody's talked to me like that in a long time. Most people see the vest, the tattoos, and they either run scared or come looking for trouble." He straightened up in his seat, and for the first time, his posture carried respect rather than intimidation. The grandfather pulled up another chair, settling in with the patience of a man who had learned the value of listening. "Sometimes the scariest battles we fight are with ourselves," he said, nodding to the cook to bring over a fresh pot of coffee. The other bikers watched this exchange with growing interest, their earlier bravado melting away like morning frost in the sun. The waitress brought over cups for everyone, her hands steady now as she poured the coffee. Her grandfather had taught her that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about doing what's right even when you're scared. She saw that lesson playing out before her eyes. "I served too," the lead biker admitted, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup. "Desert Storm. Came back different. Found it easier to be tough than to be real, you know." His companions shifted uncomfortably, this was a side of their leader they hadn't seen before. The grandfather nodded, understanding in his eyes. "War changes you. But it's what you do with those changes that matters." He gestured toward his granddaughter. "She's working these double shifts to become a nurse. Wants to help veterans dealing with trauma. That's her way of fighting back against the darkness." One of the younger bikers, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked up from his coffee. "My old man was in the service. Never talked about it, but I remember him waking up screaming sometimes." He paused, struggling with words that had been locked away too long. "That's kind of why I joined this group. Felt like family, you know." The diner had taken on the hushed atmosphere of a confessional, the evening light casting warm shadows as stories began to flow. Other customers, who had been watching warily, began to relax. Some even shared their own experiences, brothers, fathers, and friends who had served, who had struggled, who had found their way back to themselves. The waitress brought out slices of apple pie, the warm aroma of cinnamon and butter adding a homey touch to the gathering. As she set them down, the lead biker looked up at her. "I owe you an apology, miss. We all do. Sometimes we forget that being strong means being kind too." Her smile was genuine this time, not the professional mask she'd worn earlier. "Pie's on the house," she said. "But only if you promise to come back and share more stories with Grandpa. He loves meeting fellow veterans." The grandfather watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. He'd seen this pattern before, how the right words at the right time could turn enemies into friends, how understanding could bridge the widest gaps. The diner was no longer divided into us and them, locals and outsiders. It had become a place of healing. As the evening deepened, the conversation turned to lighter topics. The bikers shared stories of cross-country rides, of brotherhood found on the open road. The grandfather talked about the town's history, about the community that had welcomed him home when he returned from war. The waitress listened and learned, seeing these men not as the intimidating figures they'd first appeared to be, but as complex human beings carrying their own burdens, fighting their own battles. The other customers in the diner had become part of this impromptu gathering, pulling up chairs, adding their voices to the mix. What had started as a potential confrontation had transformed into something remarkable, a reminder that beneath our tough exteriors, we're all searching for connection, understanding, and a place to belong. The night had settled into a comfortable rhythm, the diner's lights casting a warm glow over the unlikely gathering. The cook emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and pulled up a chair. He'd been listening to the conversations while preparing meals, and now he had his own story to share. "You know," he began, setting down a fresh batch of coffee for everyone, "I used to judge folks pretty hard when they walked through that door. Especially after what happened to my brother overseas. He paused, looking at the bikers with new eyes. But tonight's reminded me of something important. You can't read a book by its cover, and you sure can't heal by holding on to fear. The lead biker nodded slowly, understanding written across his face. That's why we ride, isn't it? All of us running from something, or toward something. Sometimes we forget there's more to life than being tough. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn photograph of his own, a younger version of himself in military dress, standing proud beside a helicopter. The waitress leaned against the counter, watching as her grandfather examined the photograph. She'd grown up hearing his war stories, but tonight was different. These weren't tales of heroics or battle, these were stories of human connection, of finding light in the darkest places. One of the elderly couples who had stayed throughout the evening shared how they'd been writing letters to deployed soldiers for the past 30 years. Every week, the wife said, her eyes twinkling, we send a piece of home to someone who needs it. Because sometimes the smallest kindness can save a life. The grandfather listened intently, his hands clasped around his coffee cup. That's what I learned in Nam, he said softly. The medals and commendations don't tell the real story. It's the small moments of humanity that stay with you, sharing a meal with a frightened village child, helping a fellow soldier write a letter home, finding common ground with someone you thought was your enemy. The youngest biker, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. My mom would love this place, he said, looking around the diner with newfound appreciation. She always said I needed to find the right kind of family. Maybe she was right, just took me a while to understand what she meant. Outside, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the parking lot where the motorcycles stood. Their chrome gleamed less threateningly now, more like symbols of freedom than intimidation. Through the windows, passers-by could see the unusual group gathered inside, leather-clad bikers sharing pie with elderly couples, a grandfather teaching young men about true strength, a waitress witnessing the power of understanding. The town sheriff, making his usual evening rounds, stopped by to check on the diner. What he found surprised him, not the chaos he'd been warned about by nervous residents, but a scene of reconciliation and community. He joined the group briefly, adding his own perspective about how judgment and fear often stood in the way of understanding. As the evening wore on, plans began to take shape. The bikers talked about organizing a veteran support group, using their love of motorcycles to help others find healing on the open road. The grandfather offered to share his experience with PTSD counseling, and the waitress spoke about her future plans to work with veteran healthcare. The diner had become more than just a local eatery, it had transformed into a place of possibility, where barriers broke down and new connections formed. The regulars who had stayed throughout the evening found themselves part of something special, witnesses to the kind of change that happens when people choose understanding over fear. The waitress looked at her grandfather with new admiration. He hadn't just defended her, he'd shown her and everyone else the power of wisdom over force, of listening over judging. His quiet strength had turned a potential crisis into an opportunity for healing, not just for those directly involved, but for the entire community. As the clock neared closing time, the diner's door chimed again. This time, it was the town's retired high school teacher, known for his evening walks. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident on his face as he took in the scene before him. The bikers, who had caused such concern earlier, were now deep in conversation with the grandfather, their leather vests and badges catching the light as they gestured animatedly. You won't believe what I just heard at the community center, the teacher said, pulling up a chair. People were worried about trouble at the diner, some even called for an emergency town meeting. He chuckled, shaking his head at the contrast between the rumors and reality. Wait till they see what's really happening here. The lead biker rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Guess we've given people reason to worry before. But maybe it's time for a change. He turned to his companions, his voice carrying the weight of decision. What if we used our next rally to raise funds for the Veterans Hospital? Show folks there's more to us than noise and leather. The waitress, who had been restocking sugar dispensers nearby, brightened at the idea. The hospital's always short on resources for their PTSD program, she said, drawing from her nursing school knowledge. A fundraiser could make a real difference. Her grandfather nodded approvingly. Sometimes the best way to heal yourself is to help others heal, he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of experience. When I came back from Vietnam, it was teaching self-defense that helped me find my way again. Gave me purpose, a way to protect rather than harm. The cook, who had been listening while cleaning up, called out from the kitchen. My brother's band plays at the VFW hall. They'd probably love to perform at a fundraiser. The suggestion sparked a flurry of ideas, as everyone began contributing thoughts on how to transform the bikers' notorious rallies into community events. The youngest member of the motorcycle group pulled out his phone, showing pictures of previous charity rides they'd done in other towns. We've got connections with other chapters too, he explained. Could make this bigger than just our local group. As they talked, the waitress noticed something remarkable. The other customers, who had stayed out of fear earlier in the evening, were now actively engaging in the conversation. An elderly woman offered to coordinate with her quilting circle to make blankets for the Veterans Hospital. A businessman in a suit suggested using his company's social media to promote the event. The grandfather sat back, watching the transformation with quiet satisfaction. He'd seen this kind of change before, how shared purpose could bridge the deepest divides. His granddaughter caught his eye, and they exchanged a knowing look. What had started as a tense confrontation had bloomed into something neither of them could have predicted. Outside, the street lights cast long shadows across the parking lot, where the bikers' motorcycles stood like silent sentinels. A few curious neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, peering through the diner's windows at the unexpected scene within. Instead of the chaos they'd feared, they saw a community coming together, breaking bread and breaking down barriers. The retired teacher, who had taught many of the town's residents, including the waitress, shared his own perspective. You know, in 30 years of teaching, I learned that the toughest kids often carried the deepest wounds. It wasn't discipline they needed, it was understanding. He looked around the diner, a smile crinkling his eyes. What's happening here tonight? This is the kind of lesson you can't teach from a textbook. The lead biker stood up, stretching his back after hours of conversation. Never thought I'd say this, but this little diner's changed something in me. He looked at his reflection in the window again, but this time with pride rather than defensiveness. Maybe it's time we changed how people see us, starting right here in this town. The diner's ancient wall clock ticked steadily toward midnight, but nobody seemed eager to leave. The waitress had switched off the neon "open" sign, yet the energy inside remained vibrant with possibility. She watched as her grandfather pulled out a worn notebook from his back pocket, the kind he'd carried through his military service, and began jotting down ideas for the upcoming veterans fundraiser. You know what we could do? One of the bikers suggested, leaning forward with enthusiasm. We could organize motorcycle escorts for military funerals. Show proper respect for those who served. His voice carried a hint of emotion as he added, did that once for a fallen brother. Meant the world to his family. The grandfather's eyes lit up at the suggestion. And we could extend that to hospital visits for veterans who can't get out much. He turned to his granddaughter. Your nursing studies could help us understand what they need most. The waitress felt a surge of pride. Her dream of helping veterans had always seemed distant, something that would have to wait until after nursing school. But now, surrounded by this unlikely alliance of bikers, community members, and her grandfather, she could see how to start making a difference immediately. The cook emerged from the kitchen again, carrying a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of his special midnight muffins, a recipe he usually reserved for holidays. Been thinking, he said, distributing the warm muffins. My kitchen could help with meals for veteran families in need. Got plenty of food that would just go to waste otherwise. As the group continued brainstorming, the local sheriff, who had returned to check on things, shared his own insight. "You know, having reformed bikers talking to troubled teens could make a real impact. Show them there's always another path." He looked meaningfully at the youngest biker. Sometimes the best mentors are the ones who've faced similar struggles. The lead biker pulled out his phone and started making calls to other chapter members, his voice carrying a new sense of purpose. The responses he received were overwhelmingly positive, other riders eager to be part of something meaningful, something bigger than themselves. Through the diner's windows, the night had settled like a comfortable blanket over the town. The street lights cast gentle halos on the empty sidewalks, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, a reminder of journeys and destinations, of paths taken and choices made. The retired teacher, who had been quietly observing, spoke up again. "You know what strikes me about tonight? It's not just about veterans or bikers or any one group. It's about how quickly things can change when we stop seeing each other as threats and start seeing each other as people." The waitress's grandfather nodded, his weathered hands still moving across the notebook pages. "In war, you learn quick that the guy next to you might look different, talk different, come from somewhere completely different, but when it matters, none of that counts. What counts is what's in here." He tapped his chest meaningfully. One of the elderly couples who had stayed throughout the evening shared their own perspective. "We've lived in this town for 50 years, the wife said, her hand clasped in her husband's. "Seen lots of changes, some good, some bad. But what's happening here tonight? This is the kind of change that lasts." The youngest biker, who had been messaging on his phone, looked up excitedly. "Just heard from some friends in neighboring towns. They want to know if they can join our fundraiser. Word spreading already." The waitress couldn't help but smile as she watched these former strangers planning together, sharing stories, and building bridges. She thought about how differently the evening could have ended, with fear, anger, and reinforced prejudices. Instead, thanks to her grandfather's wisdom and everyone's willingness to listen, something beautiful was growing. As the night deepened, a gentle rain began to fall outside the diner, creating a cozy atmosphere inside. The soft patter against the windows seemed to underscore the importance of the moment, as if nature itself was blessing the unexpected gathering. The grandfather looked at his watch, then at the growing list of plans and promises in his notebook, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know what this reminds me of," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmur of conversations. "Back in Nam, we had this unwritten rule. No matter what happened during the day, the fighting, the fear, the chaos, when we sat down to share a meal, we were just humans. No rank, no divisions, just people trying to make it through another day." The lead biker, who had been making notes on a napkin, nodded in understanding. Desert Storm was different, but some things stay the same. Breaking bread together, it does something to people. Changes how you see each other. He gestured around the diner. "Like tonight. Who would have thought we'd end up here, planning all this?" The waitress had been moving between tables, refreshing coffee cups and clearing plates, but her mind was racing with possibilities. She'd already started a group chat with her nursing school classmates, many of whom were excited about volunteering their time for the veteran support initiatives. The cook stuck his head out from the kitchen again. "Just got off the phone with my supplier," he announced. "They're willing to donate food for the fundraiser. Said they've been looking for a way to give back to the community." This news was met with appreciative nods and murmurs of approval. Outside, more townspeople had gathered despite the rain, drawn by the unusual sight of motorcycles parked peacefully outside the diner at this late hour. Through the windows, they could see the unlikely group inside, working together as if they'd known each other for years. The sheriff, who had stayed to help coordinate the security aspects of the planned events, shared his own observation. "You know what's really special about this? It's not just about one night or one event. What's happening here is changing how people think about each other. Already got calls from folks asking how they can help. The youngest biker had been busy on social media, and his phone kept buzzing with notifications. "It's going viral in the riding community," he said excitedly. Other chapters are asking if they can start similar programs in their towns. They're calling it the Diner Revolution. The retired teacher chuckled at this. Revolutions don't always need violence or loud voices, he mused. Sometimes they just need a small diner, some good coffee, and people willing to listen to each other. The grandfather's granddaughter paused in her work, taking in the scene before her. The diner's warm lights illuminated faces that had transformed from threatening to friendly, from suspicious to understanding. She thought about how she'd felt earlier that evening, the fear, the uncertainty, and marveled at how completely things had changed. One of the elderly ladies who had stayed throughout the evening spoke up, her voice quavering slightly with emotion. "I've been scared of motorcycle groups ever since my son had a bad experience years ago. But tonight's shown me how wrong it is to judge people based on appearance or reputation. Sometimes the scariest-looking people have the biggest hearts." The lead biker's face softened at her words. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small pin, a symbol of their motorcycle club. "Ma'am, would you do us the honor of becoming our first honorary member? We could use someone with your wisdom to help guide our new direction." The gesture brought tears to the elderly woman's eyes, and several others in the diner had to wipe their eyes as well. It was more than just a pin, it was a symbol of the barriers that had been broken down, the fears that had been overcome. The early morning hours had crept up on the gathering, with the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside fresh and new, much like the transformations that had taken place inside the small diner. The grandfather stood up slowly, his joints creaking slightly, but his eyes bright with satisfaction. "Before we all head home," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment, "I want to share one last thing." He reached into his wallet and pulled out another photograph, even more worn than the ones he'd shown earlier. "This was taken the day I came home from Vietnam. I was lost, angry, didn't know how to fit back into normal life. But this diner," he gestured around the room, "and this community, they gave me a second chance." They looked past the broken soldier and saw the person underneath. The lead biker stood up as well, extending his hand to the grandfather. "Tonight, you did the same for us. We came in here thinking we were tough guys, but you showed us what real strength looks like." He turned to the waitress. "And you, miss, I want you to know that your future patients will be lucky to have someone who's seen firsthand how healing happens, not just with medicine, but with understanding." The waitress felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked around the diner. The elderly couples who had stayed, the cook who had fed them all night, the sheriff who had seen potential instead of trouble, the retired teacher who had shared his wisdom, each person had contributed to this remarkable night. Outside, the first birds had begun their morning songs, their melodies mixing with the distant sound of early traffic. The town was waking up to a new day, unaware that in this small diner, something profound had taken place, a reminder that change often happens in the quietest moments, in the most unexpected places. The youngest biker checked his phone one last time. "The post about tonight has gone viral," he said, amazed. "People are sharing their own stories of transformation, of finding understanding in unexpected places. We're trending in 3 states." The cook emerged from the kitchen with breakfast boxes for everyone, a parting gift of fresh muffins and coffee for the road. "My door's always open," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "To all of you. This diner's seen a lot of stories over the years, but this one's special." As the group began to gather their things, the grandfather's granddaughter noticed something remarkable.